is that he's very powerful at this point in his career as a king. That it's taken a while to build up to that, to become this king that is governing over God's entire people, his entire nation, to unify the pro-Saul camp with the pro-David camp. And we see kind of the culmination of that as he's reigning in Jerusalem, that he enters into this war with Ammon and is really able to just impose his will on them. And it's becoming less and less the case where he's actually the one having to go in and lead these battles, because he has a very reliable soldier on his side. And who is that? We talked about him on Sunday night in our men's devotion. It's Joab, right? And so Joab, I look at Joab, he's kind of become, I think, what David was to Saul early on in that relationship. That even though Saul didn't necessarily like David, maybe the relationship was a little different, Saul knew he could rely on David, that David was a mighty warrior, and I think Joab has been that kind of guy. He's somebody that doesn't shy away from a fight. When you read in the Chronicles account and they're taking over Jerusalem, he's the first one to run up the tunnel there for that water stream and enter into the city and to take it over. He's facing what appears to be certain death in a battle a couple chapters ago, and he says, you know what, God, we'll just let him do what seems right to him, and we're going to fight this battle. And so Joab is somebody that whatever needs to be done, he's going to do it. And I think I like what Ray said on Sunday night, that for Joab, or for David rather, Joab was very useful. I think that's the case. And so I talked about how at the end of chapter 10, between like the next 3 chapters, there's kind of a key word that keeps popping up. It's a small word, a short word. Might be kind of insignificant, but I think it says something of David's power. What's that key word that pops up like 23 times? Sent, right? You're going to read in the next few chapters that David is doing a lot of sending. There's a lot of messengers being sent and soldiers being sent and people being sent for and people being sent away. And that's an indication of somebody with a lot of power. David has a lot of things at his disposal. And when we get into chapter 11, we're going to see David using that same power that he's been able to use to dominate the nations around him and to establish himself as king. We're going to see him use that power in a way that is ultimately corrupting, right? And so we always say that absolute power, it corrupts absolutely. And I think David is an example of that, somebody who has otherwise been a man after God's own heart up to this point. I think we look at things in David's history to this point, and maybe we can say, well, there's kind of some weird stuff here and there, but overall, he's been a very faithful individual. And now he's at this point where I think things have just become easy. And if we learn anything about whether we look at the Bible or our own relationship with God, when things are easy, man, that's when we should really be paying attention, right? Because that's when our guard is down and when Satan seems to creep in. And I think that's the case with David. And so I want to just start off by reading, we'll just look at verse 1, and this is going to give us the setting here. It says, in the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. And so at the end of chapter 10, there was this fight kind of starting with the Ammonites, and that's continuing now. And there's some people that think the grammar, rather than saying in the spring of that year, it says something more along the lines of like a year later. Like this is maybe the 1-year anniversary of when this battle or this fight initially started. But either case, they're still fighting. This is still a war that's going on. But just in this first verse, I think the author is beginning to kind of show us a picture of David at this point in his life. And so what does this kind of imply, or what does this tell us about David? How does this set up what we're about to read? Okay, not doing what he should be doing as king. What should he be doing? Going out to battle. It's right there in the text, right? This is a time of year where the kings were going out to war. And so you have this picture of David's men. They're out in the trenches. They're living in tents. They're away from their families. And then that's like the camera, the scene changes to David. And where are we? We're not out on the battlefield. We're not away from family. He's at home and he's in Jerusalem, right? And what is he doing? What's the first thing it says that he's doing when we read about him? In verse 2. It says, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. So there you have it. You have this contrast of what his men are doing, the people he's governing. They're out fighting wars for him. And then you see this picture of David, and he's sitting on his couch. Things have gotten really easy for him. And I think it's kind of interesting looking back a couple chapters in 2 Samuel chapter 8. There's a phrase that pops up twice in that chapter. You might remember that. And we see it once in verse 6 of chapter 8 and then once in verse 14 at the end. And this is just kind of going through all of his victories, but it says at the end of verse 14 of chapter 8, it says, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And unfortunately, we get a different picture in chapter 11. Rather than this king that's going out to war and is constantly extending the territory under God's decree, we have a king that's not going anywhere. He's just staying home at Jerusalem. And so again, I think this kind of sets up what we're about to read next. And so you get to verse 2 and 3, and again it says, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, his wife, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And so I was talking with Amy, and she brought up a good point, how there's a lot of weird relationships going on here. You have Eliam, who is, I believe he's the son of one of David's chief counselors. We read about him later on in the book of Samuel. And so just a lot of different weird relationships. But Eliam and Uriah, they have something else in common. So Eliam is Bathsheba's father, and Uriah is married to Eliam's daughter Bathsheba. But they have something else in common as well. Anybody know what that is? Yeah, they're mighty men. They're these two guys that fight together, evidently. And we read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 23. You can look it up on your own. Chapter 23, in verses 34, it mentions Eliam amongst David's mighty men. And then verse 39, it mentions Uriah, who's amongst David's mighty men. So these are two men that are in this specific subset of soldiers that could be relied upon, that were renowned for their military prowess. And so again, just very interesting seeing the different connections going on here. But when you look at this, there's a quote that came to mind, idle hands are the devil's tools. You guys ever hear that before? And I look at David, and he's somebody that is idle at this point in his life, that he should have been out there doing something, and yet he has all this free time. He's sitting, he's relaxing, he's just enjoying the ease of life, and one day he's out on his roof, and this was a very common thing in those days, that if it was hot, they couldn't turn on the AC unit, right? And so they would hang out in the roof area, and the breezes would come through. And he's the king, right? This is his palace, so he can see, and people would bathe often outside, obviously. They didn't have showers in their homes, and so they'd be bathing. And I want you to notice, as you guys know where the story eventually ends up, it starts with these two words in verse 2, he saw, right? He saw a woman from the roof, right? Very simple how this starts. And we're going to find that it ends in lies and deceit and murder. But it starts with it simply saying that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And so it's going to continue to develop here. I'll keep going. It says, so David sent. There he is. He's sending, right? Powerful guy. He's not going to go down there to his house, right, and be seen at her door. He has messengers that can do that. David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. You notice how quickly these things develop, right? It's just interesting compared to the other texts we've read. They're kind of plodding along in some cases where we get these sometimes monotonous lists of David's accomplishments. But here's David caught up in his passion, sees this woman, and is just reacting to what he's feeling in the moment. And I think that the text is indicating that pace, that David sent messengers, took her, she came to him, and he lay with her. It says, now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. and then she returned to her house. And that's kind of an interesting note there where it says that she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. What that's doing is it's indicating the risk that's going on here. That a woman, when they menstruated, they had to go through a period of uncleanness. And what this is saying is that she had just gone through that period, and otherwise, what is that indicating? What's the risk involved here? That she's fertile, that there's a chance she's going to get pregnant from this, and of course that's exactly what happens. But outside of this risk of her getting pregnant, I want to ask, what is the level of risk involved in David's decision? Just how risky of a situation is this for David if he does get caught? He's the king. So if he's caught as king, what would happen? Nothing? Okay.
I mean, if you look at all the history of all the other kings,
right.
You just get rid of everybody.
Yeah. And maybe that's where David's getting to, right? Again, that question, who watches the watchers, right? He's got so much power that maybe he thinks I can just get away with it. But go ahead, Michael.
But the problem is that he's supposed to be the servant of the Lord.
Yeah.
God is supposed to be the high.
Yeah. So I think that when you look at, whether we look at the end of Judges or when we look at the beginning of Samuel and the people are asking for a king, really, who's the king? It's God, right? And this human king is just supposed to be like the one that carries out his will. It's God who's in charge. And so if that's the case, is the king exempt from rules that apply to the rest of the people? In theory, no, right? And so I ask that question again, what's the risk that's involved here? If somebody else was caught doing what David's doing here, what would happen to them in Israel's day in particular? They get stoned, right? Death, right? That's what it says in Leviticus 20 in verse 10. It says, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So who's at risk of dying here if they get caught, if David gets caught? Well, yeah, David and Bathsheba. Now, the text is absolutely silent as to exactly what Bathsheba's role is. There's some people that think, well, she must have been this willing participant, she's not so innocent, but I would submit that it would be very hard to say no to the king of the land, that there's some muscles being flexed there. Either way, I'm not here to state her innocence, but what I do believe is that if they get caught, David isn't just jeopardizing himself, he's potentially jeopardizing this woman as well. And so literally this is a potentially life or death situation. Not to mention, if David gets caught and the people decide not to put him to death, well, you still have the problem of his reputation. There's going to be people that are questioning his decisions. There's going to be distrust in the nation. And so there's a lot riding on this if he gets caught. And so I guess the follow-up question to that is, why is David willing to take this risk? And I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Why is David willing to take this risk? Yep, not thinking with his head. Maybe he's not just even considering the risk. Maybe he's just thinking about what he wants from a lustful standpoint. Anybody else? Michael, you had your hand up. No.
Because you said something about how he saw.
Yes. Well, that's true. I mean, you see that common, that's very common, right? That Eve saw the fruit, that it was good to eat. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's very, very much being echoed from Genesis 3. I got you there. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking of the fact that I guess from our own history, like you had the Vietnam War and then you had Hades.
Mm-hmm.
Like they came out of the same thing where and they try to balance the scale. So like it was this warrior, but like he's also a musician, so like the artist, he's a lover, he's got that aspect of it too. And like so I don't know, it's that experience.
Yeah, just emotions taking over, passions taking over. Yeah. 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 Anybody else? Why is David willing to take this risk? I guess we could step back a little bit. When in our culture today, and we're all in marriages, right? We're not kings, but we're not all in marriages, but a lot of us here in this room are in marriages. Is there risk involved when somebody decides to commit adultery? What is a person risking when they do that? Their marriage, their family, right? I think David was also risking those things. Why does a person decide they're going to do that? Again, I don't know. That's something, maybe it depends on the specific situation. But what do you guys think? Many reasons, yeah.
It's probably a good mix of rational and emotional. It's not something that just sit there and make a list on a piece of paper, all the pros and cons.
Mhm.
It's just, Margaret said, it's just not really thinking through things.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
And as far as the narrative is concerned, he's on time. So like I look at it as just being completed.
Yeah.
And kind of decided not being a steward
Mm.
of getting
Yeah. Yeah. I think these things just they kind of grow, right? One foolish decision follows another. Go ahead, Ray.
It's
Yeah.
almost like you don't really make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Like John said, you don't sit down and list all the pros and cons. It's more of just you're running on instinct. You're not thinking about it enough in the way that we usually say we make decisions. You really don't do that. You kind of just go with something that's kind of instinctual, and it happens, and all of a sudden you realize, oops.
So it's a lack of decision making. It's something else taking over, right? Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I kind of see what you're saying for sure. I think sin has a way of like we can kind of just go on autopilot and just let sin take over, right? Not in a way that excuses us from the actions, but yeah, yeah, yeah. Ronnie, what were you going to say? I thought Ronnie's hand went up. No, okay. What were you?
Really a ton of focus on self. It's selfishness. You think about not just the damage to the immediate relationship, but all the collateral damage that ripples out. It's even generational.
Yeah, in David's life, yeah. And I think that if you're in a situation where you're being tempted, often it's not that like we're conscious of like how we're thinking of ourselves. It's just we're not thinking of anybody else, and that is selfishness, isn't it? And I think that's where David's at. He's not thinking of anybody else. He's just kind of following his passions, right? I always wonder if James had this story in mind. It just seems to match up so well with what we see happen in David's story with Bathsheba in James 1, verses 13 through 15, where he says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." So don't say we're being tempted by God, right? That's our responsibility. But in verse 14 he says, "Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." I don't know why, that seems to really match what's going on here in the story in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different angles. There's Uriah that dies. You have Bathsheba giving birth to this son born in sin. That just seems to match up. But either case, James kind of gives us insight into how sin works. In other words, people often, when they're caught in serious sins, they'll say, well, man, it just happened, right? They'll fall on kind of, Ray, I agreed with what you're saying, but sometimes people fall on that like a crutch, right? Like, it just happened. I can't explain it. But with sin, what James is saying is that there's a process that gets you to that point. And so do we see a process playing out in David's life? How would you respond if David said, it just happened, right? What would you point at in the text that says, no, it didn't just happen? It was a process that we can kind of see in the scriptures. Weren't where you should have been, right? What else? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, who knows by this point? Yeah. Anybody else? Mhm. Yeah, and that's why it's so important to cut ourselves off at the knees, right? I think that's almost kind of what Jesus is getting at when he says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, right? Do what's necessary to keep yourself from sinning. And I think there's a lot of decisions that are made by David in this story that precedes, obviously the murder of Uriah the Hittite, but even Bathsheba, and you said one of them. I think there's a lot that goes into that little phrase, he saw, right? I mean, David, it wasn't necessarily his fault initially that he saw a woman that was nude bathing, but when did it become his fault, do you think? Or when he looked a little longer than he should have as well. I think he could even back up before he sent somebody, that he's got this lingering look. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 5 when he talks about, in verse 28, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I think that the story of David is an illustration of that. In other words, by the time Bathsheba gets up into his palace, do you think David really had a fighting chance at that point in overcoming this sin? I mean, technically, he could have said no, but what were you going to say, Alan? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, how many times when we're being tempted, I don't care what it is, whether it's, I'm trying not to drink soda lately, it's like, but I love soda. I think I told my wife the other day, it's like one of my favorite things in the world, and she was like a little bit offended that I said that. But I love soda, and I'm like trying to say no to it, but it's so easy to rationalize, like, man, it's hot out today, it's just one. Yeah, but one becomes two. Yeah, right. But even, with sin as well, when we're being tempted, when it's something that our body wants, we're so good at getting ourselves mentally to that place where we're giving ourselves permission to do it, where we're giving ourselves, we're saying, it's okay, you can do it. And maybe that's kind of a little bit what's going on with David. So a problem happens, right? I think that David thought that this was something that would happen. Really, in his mind, it was the perfect time to do something like this when all the other men are at war. There's no way that Uriah is going to find out about this. His servants would never betray him and tell other people about it because they know that they would be in trouble. But David's plan is foiled by what? Obviously, what happens next? Yep. And so rather than David sending, you have her sending a message saying, I'm pregnant. And this is a huge problem. This is David's worst nightmare that's unfolding. This is a very sobering moment, I believe, in his life. And I think that we can relate to times where we've been caught in our sin, whether it's as an adult, whether it was when we were little, and you're seeing the writing on the wall and realizing people that I didn't want to find out about this are about to find out about it. And I think that we all have felt the panic of that, right? And trying to run through the scenarios. Should I just, how can I cover this up? I think that's where our minds, we don't like to admit it, that's probably where our minds go to more often than we would like to say. But hopefully we choose, I'm going to come clean. David doesn't choose that, does he? He says, okay, how can I cover this up? And the problem is David has a very narrow time window if he's going to solve this problem. Why is that time window so narrow? She'll start showing, and people will put two and two together. Uriah wasn't here around that time, right? So what happened, right? So he's scrambling, I imagine, David, at this point. I think he's really scrambling when he decides not to own up to it. And I think that you can kind of see that in the text with our key word. David sent word to Joab. It's actually used 3 times in verse 6. He sent word to Joab, send me Uriah. Joab sent Uriah to David. David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it. Joab sent and told David. And then in between that, you have all the back and forth between David and Uriah as well. But I think that when you see it like that, is David scrambling? Yeah, he's scrambling. He's trying to cover this up, and we're going to see that just gets him into even more problems. And so why doesn't somebody read verses 6 through 6? We'll do it this way. How about somebody read 6 through 10? And then we'll have somebody read 12 through 13. Whoever wants to do that. 6 through 10 and 12 through 13. Okay, go ahead.
Then David said to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. David said to Uriah, Go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah departed from the king's house, and gave him food, and the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house, and all the servants of his lord did not go down to his house. So when they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, Did you not come from journey? Why did you not go down to your house?
And then 11 through 13, whoever wants to read that.
And Uriah said to David, The ark is Israel, you are safe for a shelter. My lord Joab, the servants of my lord are entering with the field. Shall I enter to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul will not be mistaken. David said to Uriah, Stay here today also, and tomorrow so let us go. So Uriah remained sleeping that day and the next. David called him, and he ate some bread before him. He made him drunk, and in the evening he went out to lie on his bed with his servant. But he did not go down to his house.
So how would you describe the tactics that David tries to use here to solve this problem of his, to cover up his sin? What are the various tactics you think that he uses? Go ahead, Michael. Yeah, crafty, right? Yeah. What else? Serpent-like, I like that. Deceitful, manipulative. I think it starts with his reaching out to Joab. What does he do that's kind of deceitful in just his message to Joab? To Joab initially. Yes. Yeah, that too. Verse 7 when, excuse me, let's see here. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so with Uriah in verse 7. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Yeah, David's really concerned about that, isn't he? And I think that we laugh a little bit because maybe you experience that with your kids, but we've probably all been guilty of this, or maybe we've been the Uriah that somebody's talking about, where somebody's guilty of something and they're kind of asking, trying to build a bridge a little bit, but really they're trying to get to some information, right, as they're scrambling to cover up their sin. I think David really isn't all that concerned about Joab at this point. He's just trying to deal with the awkwardness. I'm sure Uriah is like, why am I here? Right? I'm sure that he's confused about it, and David's trying to figure out, okay, how do I deal with that, right? But how else is David manipulative? What else? I like that word that Julia used, obviously deceptive, but I think manipulative strikes a chord with me as I read his tactics here. What does he do that's manipulative? Yeah, getting him drunk, that's pretty manipulative. What else? I don't know that he's bribing him. I think what he's trying to do is, what's his goal initially with Uriah? I'll let somebody else answer. What's his goal when he brings Uriah back? Go ahead, Amy. Yes. Yeah, and that way it could fit in bribery, right? But this is the small window. You get Uriah back, get him to sleep with his wife, and then she'll start showing, but everybody will think it's Uriah's baby. Uriah will think that it's his child as well. And David has successfully covered his tracks, which is kind of interesting to me because I take that like David's totally fine with not raising this child as well. When you start thinking about it, if his plan actually works, Uriah thinks it's his child, Uriah raises his child, and he just doesn't think twice about it, which is kind of interesting to me, especially when we see how much he apparently cares about the child when he's weeping over the child's death in the next chapter. So yeah, that's the goal, and he's manipulating him, as Amy said, go down, relax, right? When he says go wash your feet, a lot of people think that's a euphemism for go lay with your wife, that the Hebrews would have picked up on, that's kind of lost on us. But yeah, being manipulative, I think that you see that all the way through verse 13, all the way down to him trying to get him drunk. And what's interesting is that a drunk Uriah, right, because David succeeds in getting him drunk, but then does Uriah go down and sleep with his wife? So that's right, and there's a lot going on. I think that Uriah is this contrast to David. This servant, this guy who's not even an Israelite, has more honor, right, and more loyalty to his countrymen, is more willing to go out and fight this battle than David is. And then I think that you see that really clearly when a drunk Uriah has more self-control than a sober David, right? That David gets him drunk and he still decides to sleep with his servants. His mentality is, how can I go and do these things when these guys I fight with, they're out fighting this battle? Which, don't you think that would kind of cut David when he says that? You almost wonder if it's a little bit of a jab towards David as well, if Uriah is maybe implying, hey, you should be out there with us too. Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Julia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you have, yeah. 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 And I've talked to Chris about that, so I'm glad you brought that up, because, yeah, Chris's view is that Uriah kind of knows what's going on. And I don't think that's all that far-fetched. Again, don't you think he'd already be wondering, like, why am I back? He must have some big message for me. And then he's like, hey, Uriah, how's Joab doing? Like, okay, this is kind of weird. Hey, go sleep with your wife. It's, and factor in, maybe he's talked with Bathsheba for all we know. Who knows? Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility, that Uriah isn't fooled by any of this, which, if that's the case, that's all the more reason for David and his kind of worldly view that he has right now to deal with Uriah once and for all. And so he actually has the gall in verse 14 to write a letter to Joab, basically telling him to have Uriah put to death in a way that makes it look like, he dies in battle. And who is it that carries the letter? That's low, isn't it? I mean, come on, that's low. That's pretty crazy. And the fact that Uriah doesn't open the letter, I think, again, says something about Uriah, doesn't it? That he is somebody that can be trusted to deliver this message and not look at it and see what it says, when perhaps he's already very suspicious of what David's up to. And so in verse 14 it says, in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by hand of Uriah. And the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite died also. And then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And I just kind of briefly want to look at this passage. Maybe I'm reading a little bit more into it than I should. A lot of people will read this and say, see, Joab did exactly what David asked him to do. And I think Joab mostly does what David asks him to do, but it does look like maybe he makes a slight modification to the initial plan that David drew up. And so what might be the difference between what David told him to do and how Joab actually carried it out? Do you see any difference? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like telling everybody to fall back and let Uriah just die by himself.
I mean, but that's what Joab does, right? He falls back, he withdraws from battle, right, and leaves a guy just by himself, undefended, right? That's something Joab is known for doing? No, right? That's not what Joab is known for. And that is interesting that if people start looking at that, if Joab does it the way David tells him to, who would be the first person that would be blamed? It would be Joab, I would think, wouldn't it? And so, David, again, just thinking of himself, totally willing, I think, for somebody else to take the fall to cover up his sin. And so I think what he actually does is a little different in that he does not withdraw. He positions him in the hardest portion of the battle. And it's not just Uriah that ends up dying, it's all his, not all, but several other men as well. And so I think that in that way, he allows Uriah to die a more honorable death, but also is doing David a favor, and I think carried it out in a way that people aren't going to be suspicious as well. And so that's where Joab is kind of this interesting character as we read through the story as far as his role and what did Joab know exactly? I mean, what was in that letter? It's just who knows. I want to focus for a minute, and this isn't on my slide, on this message that Joab gives to David, or he gives to his messenger to give to David. In verse 19, it says, he instructed the messenger, when you finish telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger arises, and if he says to you, why do you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. What's interesting about this to me is that the author includes this, and then the actual message doesn't go anything like that. David doesn't have any of those objections. Seems like the messenger just, at least how it's related to us, just kind of tells them, these men died and also Uriah the Hittite died. And David doesn't have any of these objections and isn't critical, but I think it's very interesting that we have insight into what Joab is anticipating as far as how David will respond to this news. And I think that what it indicates is that there's some tension going on between David and Joab. What does this tell us about how Joab thinks about David, or what Joab thinks of David? Go ahead, Amy. Well, and also that he's anticipating, you're asking me to do this horrible thing, and then you also have the gall to criticize how I'm fighting the battle. It's like you got bigger problems. Of course, I don't think David does react that way, but it's interesting to see what Joab is anticipating. Andy, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
I don't believe it was intentional, but if you were Joab and got that letter, you alluded to how old.
Yeah.
He sent that letter
Yeah.
to hand of Uriah.
Yeah, good point.
Joab get that letter and you're like, all right. Well, the power of all the threat of David, to me, Joab in the position of, wow, I see David killing a man, I see him killing me.
Yeah.
What can you restore for me?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, this is go ahead, Ray. Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah.
you indicate, Joab orchestrated all this so it wouldn't look like Joab was
Yeah.
killing him.
Right.
But as we read through this, see, Joab knows that what he is doing is not good military strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that if David finds this out, all this is said because David would know also. But he did a stupid thing, Joab.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah.
So that last little bit, Uriah's dead, that takes away all of David's
Yeah.
objections to what he did in that battle, his strategy.
Yeah, so in my mind when I read this, my Sam Bray paraphrase was Joab anticipating David saying something like, Joab, how did you do something so stupid? That was a really stupid strategy. And Joab's response is basically, hey, David, that stupid thing you wanted me to do, it's done. That's kind of how I think this message would have come across. And so it's interesting the messenger doesn't deliver it exactly that way. Maybe he's realizing how it came across as well. Anyways, that's kind of how I took that for what it's worth. Verse 22, we just are almost out of time here. I'll go a couple minutes over. But the messenger came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate, and the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it," and encourages him. I think with that statement, David's corruption, it's complete, isn't it? That he has this horrible thing carried out, and David feels so bad about it. He's losing so much sleep. No. Right? This guy who lamented over Jonathan, over Saul, over Abner, will not lament over one of his own men, right? Oh, it's just, people die. That's basically what David's attitude is at this point. Let's see. So this is interesting. The way the story ends, when the mourning was over, of course, Bathsheba's mourning when she finds out about this. And it says, when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. By the way, when Samuel was warning the people about what the king would do, what was the word that kept coming up? What was the word? The king will take. That's 1 Samuel 8. Here you have the king. He's taking, isn't he? He took a man's wife, took a man's life. But David isn't going to get away with it. The next chapter, verse 1 of the next chapter, I think I put verse 28. That's not true. It's chapter 12, verse 1. It says, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. So David's the one sending, isn't he? But who's sending in chapter 12? It's God. God's got his own messenger that he's going to send to David. And so as we wrap up, just a few lessons for me that I take away from this story, and I'm sure you've heard similar points as you've heard this lesson preached on and taught on. Bigger sins are often preceded by, quote, smaller sins, aren't they? It's like one has a tendency to lead to the other because often we're scared of getting caught, and so what do we do because we're scared to get caught? We lie, right? There's another sin. And I got to keep up with these lies, right? And lies on top of lies on top of lies. Idleness yields temptation and sin. We find that's the case even in the New Testament, right? Paul warns about that on a couple different occasions, not for us to be idle. And so you young people, as you're getting ready for school next week, understand that part of paradise, part of the creation mandate was that man would work, that God's people would have a job to do. And I think that when we're doing that, it's keeping us from getting into trouble. If you want to find men in this world in particular that have all sorts of messed up problems in their life, you'll find somebody that's probably pretty idle, that's pretty lazy. Covering up sin simply compounds sin. But here's the thing, if it can happen to David, can it happen to me? A man after God's own heart, a man that God chose, a man that's still thought of pretty highly when you get to the New Testament. If it can happen to David, it can happen to any one of us, right? And that's what's sobering, I think, about this story. What lessons do you guys take away from this? I know we're going a little bit over, but I'm curious if anybody has anything to add to that.
You want to be sure to counter the things that were a problem with the opposite. So think of what's the counter to covetousness. In chapter 12, Nathan, through God's words, lays it all out about all the incorrect. I gave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gave you all this. I did. And then you disrespected me.
Mm-hmm.
It was God's word. So, lesson for me is grateful for what you have. Just be content. Respect God.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
You'll be in a pretty good place if you can basically put loving God as the first priority.
Yeah. Bonus question, how many of the 10 Commandments did David break in this story? Half of them? You got half. Go ahead. 4? You say 4? Yeah, I got at least 3. Covetousness, do not commit adultery, do not murder. Stealing, stealing. Yep. Lying, bear false witness. Yep. So, here you have the king of Israel, a man who loves the law, committing all these, in all these ways breaking the law. Anyways, thanks for your time. Enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought about calling Chris because I remember having that interesting conversation with him about it. I've been talking.